Hello everyone and welcome back to Dynamix Academy. This is yet another video in a feature a day video series. In this video series we will cover the new features that were released with Microsoft Dynamics 365 9.0 version. On your screen you are able to see the various new features that were released in 9.0 version of Dynamics 365. We will see each of these feature in detail per video in this series, and at the same time we will also see the various deprecations that are going to happen with Dynamics 365 9.0 version release. So this series is going to be very much useful and informative. So let us now see the feature that we are going to cover in this video. The feature that we are going to cover in this video is virtual entities that were released with Microsoft Dynamics 365 9.0 version, where we will see each and everything about the virtual entities, how you can create them, how you can utilize them, what are the benefits, limitations, restrictions, everything. So this video is going to be very much useful and informative, so watch it till the end. Let me now begin this video by setting up the agenda. First, we will see what was the situation till now, and then we will see what are virtual entities in Dynamics 365 9.0 version, what are the benefits of virtual entities, as well as we will also see the limitations and restrictions while utilizing virtual entities. And after that, I will show you a practical demo of how you can create virtual entities in Dynamics 365 9.0 version. And at the end, we will also see what are the different things that you need to keep in mind while working with virtual entities. So let me now give you a brief recap of what was the situation till now before the addition of virtual entities. So previously, the options for integrating external data sources into your dynamic solutions were limited. Usually, it involved persisting external data within your organization database or developing a client-side script to pull the required data on demand basis. So if there was a need to for integration with external data source, then either you need to copy or somehow you need to retrieve the external data into your Dynamics 365 instance on demand basis. And it also required customized code and suffered from numerous limitations like imperfect integrations, data duplications, or extensive commitment of development resources. So let us now see what are virtual entities in Dynamics 365. Microsoft Dynamics 365 version 9.0 offers a new way of integrating external data in a friendly manner by introducing virtual entities. So with advent of with this virtual entities feature, you can now integrate your external data with Dynamics 365 in a friendly manner. It behaves similar to regular entities, but instead sources its data from external sources. That means these virtual entities behave similar to the regular entities, but the data will be coming from external data source. A virtual entity is a definition of an entity in Dynamics 365 platform metadata without the associated physical tables for entity instances created in Dynamics 365 database. So when you create a virtual entity in Dynamics 365 instance, it is not going to create associated physical tables in Dynamics 365 database, but it is only going to store the metadata of external data source that you have mapped to your virtual entity, which in turn means that your actual data will still reside in the external data source, but that will be pulled into Dynamics 365 instance on demand basis. So hence, in your Dynamics 365 database for virtual entities, you will only store the metadata, but the actual data will be retrieved from the external data systems. Each virtual entity type is associated with a virtual entity data provider, and optionally some configuration information from the associated virtual entity data source. So every virtual entity will be associated with a virtual entity data provider as well as some configuration information. And the records based on virtual entities are available from all Dynamics 365 online clients, including the custom applications that are developed using Dynamics 365 SDK. So let us now see the benefits of virtual entities. One of the biggest advantage of virtual entities is that end users will now only have to work with the records created by the virtual entity to view the data in the fields, grids, search results, and fetch XML based reports and dashboard. You can export your rows to Excel. So even though the data is not stored in Dynamics 365 database, but still it gives you ability to export into Excel. But you will not be able to import them again. Since the data is residing in external sources, you will not be able to make any modifications or any changes to those retrieved virtual entity records because those are read only. System customizers can configure the data source records and create virtual entities without writing any code. Now, system customizers or non-developers or non-technical persons can also perform high-level integrations in Dynamics 365 by using these virtual entities. So, non-developers or non-technical person can configure the data source record and create virtual entities without writing a single line of code, which means it is easy to configure and use as well. You can package your virtual entities, virtual entity data providers, and virtual entity data source into a solution. So that is also one of the added advantage, which is you can package all your components related to virtual entity into a solution, and that solution you can export and import to a new environment. So you have to configure it once on your development region or a specific environment, and then you can export each and every components into your solution and export the solution and import it on your UAT or production environment. You can quickly switch between data sources through customization window. So if you have multiple data sources linked in your Dynamics 365 instance, then you have ability to switch between the data sources on your own. So that is also one of the added advantage. And now developers can implement plugins to read external data using Dynamics 365 SDK and Dynamics 365 online plugin registration tool. So having seen the benefits, let us now see the limitations of virtual entities. As we have already seen, the data is read only because the data is residing in the external data source. We are only retrieving it from the external data source. And virtual entities can only be organization owned entities. You cannot create a virtual entity with user or team on ownership type. And if you want to know the difference between user and team owned and organization owned entities, then you can visit your previous videos on the same on the entity ownership concept. You can navigate to that video by clicking the link provided on the top of your screen. As well as virtual entities does not support field level security simply because of the fact that it is organization owned. Auditing is also not supported for virtual entities. It cannot be used in roll-up and calculated fields. It cannot be an activity type because of the reasons which might be obvious that it is read-only. Knowledge management, SLAs, change tracking mobile offline, field security, Microsoft web portals are not supported for virtual entities. So you cannot use these features when you are working with virtual entities. So these were very few limitations of virtual entities. At the same time, let us now see the restrictions while working with virtual entities. So since we know that with virtual entities, you are able to retrieve data from external system. So which means that it is possible to model the external data as a Dynamics 365 entity, which means all entities in external data source must have an associated GUID as a primary key. So since each and every entity in Dynamics 365 database has an associated primary key of type GUID, so that constraint has to be applied to the external data source as well. So you can only map the external data source which has an associated primary key of type GUID. So I will show you what does this mean at the time of a practical demo. And all the entity properties must be represented as Dynamics 365 attributes. You can use simple types representing text, numbers, option set, dates, images, and lookups, which means that if your external data source is having multiple attributes linked to that particular entity, then all the attributes you need to map into Dynamics 365 supported field types for a new virtual entity. And lastly, you need to model each and every relationship in Dynamics 365, which means that if a particular attribute is set to required or non-nullable type in external system, then you need to map that relationship into Dynamics 365 while creating the field to that virtual entity. So these are the very few restrictions, but you need to understand them very carefully. So now I will show you how you can create a virtual entity in Dynamics 365 instance. So before that, you need to test following things out before creating virtual entities so that you will not face any issues on runtime basis. So first you need to access the service exposing the data in OData version 4, which is one of the supported data services in Dynamics 365. So you need to first make sure that whatever the data that you are trying to map from external data source should have an exposing service in OData version 4. At the same time, then whatever the entity that you need to map into virtual entity, or the whatever the data on that particular table that you are trying to import in, whatever the data that you are trying to map in virtual entity should have an associated primary key of type GUID. And lastly, you need to have latest preview of Dynamics 365 9.0 version. It will not be supported in previous version of Dynamics 365. If your Dynamics 365 is other than 9.0 version, then you need to upgrade it to 9.0 version first. So these are the three things that you need to make sure before trying to add a virtual entity in your Dynamics 365 instance. So as far as this demo is concerned, we are going to use odata.org site, which has exposed its underlying data for our testing purpose by navigating to these services in their site. So if you type this URL in your browser, it will show you the list of entities that are exposed using that service. So now I will open the browser and navigate to this service. I'm browsing the URL that I have shown you in my slide. So if you browse this service, you can now see that this service has exposed a number of entities that are associated with that data. So it has exposed these many entities with this metadata service using version 4 OData protocol. Now the next thing you need to check is entity that you want to map in your Dynamics 365 instance should have an primary key of type GUID. So how you can check? If you expand this first entity, so its primary key name is ID. So here you can see that property ID, and the type of that property ID is integer 32. So you cannot use this product entity anymore for mapping. So let me now check another entity. Here the primary key name is product ID, and the product ID property is of type integer 32, so you cannot use this product detail as well. So let me now quickly search. So if you open the advertisement entity, here you can see the primary key name is ID and the type of that primary key is GUID. So hence you will be able to use advertisement entity. And apart from ID, it has two other properties called name, it is of type string, and air date, which is of type date time. At the same time, let us now check if this entity is having any particular data in the external data source or not. How you can check that? You can check that by navigating to this URL. If you hit this URL, that means it is retrieving this advertisements collection, and it is showing you some sort of data, like it has this ID with this value, and the name is old school lemonade store, error date is so and so, the next record is this one. So at least it has some sort of data in the external data source. So we'll try to map this advertisement entity into our Dynamics 365 instance. So this is my trial instance. So in order to create a new virtual entity, first you need to create a virtual entity data source. So how you can create virtual entity data source? You need to navigate to settings, then go to administration, and under administration you will have virtual entity data source. So you need to click on that, and here you can see there are three virtual entity data source are already present in my Dynamics 365 instance, but I'm creating a new one. So if you create a new one, it is asking you to select a data provider. So here you need to select OData version 4 data provider, and if you click OK, then it is going to ask you to give a meaningful name first. So I've given a meaningful name, public OData source, and then it is asking you to give the URL where this OData is located. So you can copy the URL till .svc. So this will be your URL where your external data is residing. So you can copy that URL and save this record. So the number one step is to specify the external data source under the administration tab. So here you can see now a new data source has been added, and after the data source has been added, you now have to create a new virtual entity. So the process of creating a virtual entity is similar to that of how you create a custom entity. So you need to navigate to settings, customizations, customize the system, and under entities tab you have to create new entity. And while creating new entity, you first need to give the new entity name. After giving the display name and plural name, here you can see there is one more checkbox which is saying virtual entity. You need to check that checkbox. After you have selected this checkbox, now you need to select the data source. Data source you need to provide that you have created in our earlier step. So we have created a public OData source in our earlier step. So you have to select that OData source here, and you notice that two new fields has been added on the entity creation form, which is external name and external collection name. You need to provide the external name from the OData service. You need to copy the entity name from this list, that is advertisement, and the collection name should be coming from here. So here you notice that it is a plural name, advertisements. So you have to give the collection name correctly. You have to be very careful while selecting the external name and external collection name, because that will be coming from external data source. And you can notice that ownership is organization, and you will not be able to make any changes to this, as well as you will not be able to define this entity as an activity entity because this is read only. So you will not be able to change the ownership as well as the activity entity type. So now you can save this. So after creating that entity, now you will notice that there are two fields were automatically created, which is advertisement ID and new name. So that is similar process whenever you create a new custom entity. By default, some of the fields will be added to your new custom entity. But the only difference you will be able to notice here is that whenever you create a new custom entity, you will have some of the default out of the box fields which will be added to your entity, that are created on, modified on, and so on. These default fields will not be added when you create a virtual entity. So only two fields will be created, which is advertisement ID, which is of type primary key, and the name. So now you need to map these two fields to that in external data source. If you open the field, here you can see there is also one more external name added, and the field requirement is system required. So you need to map the external name. So now you need to go to that external data source. So here you can see the primary key is ID and the name of that field is ID. So now you need to copy this name and paste that name here. So now it is linked to that external data source ID column. You can save and close, and similarly you need to map the name field also. Open and map this field to the external name field. So here you can see the name field is of type string and the property name is also name. So now you can paste that name here and you can save and close. And one more thing you notice here is that in the external data source there is also one more field called air date. It is of type date time and it's a non-nullable property. That means you need to mark in Dynamics 365 as a business required field. Now you need to add one more field in your Dynamics 365 virtual entity of type datetime, and that should be of business required type. If you forget to set that business required type while creating that field, you will face the error while retrieving those records. So you need to map as it is in your Dynamics 365 instance. So let me now create an air date property. in Dynamics 365, I will copy this name. So after mapping these two fields, create a new field called air date. So now while adding this new field, you need to be very careful. You need to specify the external name correctly, as well as you need to also set the field requirement to business required, because in external data source it is non-nullable or nullable type is set to false. And also you need to map the data type correctly. So in external data source it is of type date time. You have to specify the date time data type. If you specify it to any other data type, that is going to give you a runtime error while retrieving those records. So now the configuration looks correct. So I will save and close this. Now here you can see a new field has been added called air date. It is of type date time and that is business required. Now after adding those fields, you need to add that field on the form as well in order to see the data. So I will modify the main form of the new advertisement virtual entity. I will add this air date field on the form. I will save and close. I will also add that field on the default public view, which is all advertisement, and I will add this column to that view as well. So now I will save and close this view also. So after making these changes, we will save this entity and publish this entity as well. So now it is published. So we will test this record by navigating it to the sales region, where we will see an extension called advertisement. So this is my default dashboard of my trial instance. We will navigate to the sales region and here you can see the extension called advertisement. If you click it here, so now you can see that two records are returned successfully from the external data source, which is early morning start date and with air date. Now you can know that integration is running successfully, and if you double click it, it will open that particular record, and you can notice that you are not able to modify any of the data or any of the field on that virtual entity, because these records are not present physically in Dynamics 365 database. They are still present in the external system, but they're reflected here. So these records are read only. So this is how you can retrieve data from any external data source without writing a single piece of code. It is easy and very simple to configure, but at the same time you need to be very careful while mapping the entity type from the external data source and also the attributes from the external data source. If you miss a single configuration, then also you will face some kind of error. So let me now show you. If I make this air date field on our virtual entity as non-mandatory, then we'll try to see what kind of error you will face. So this is our advertisement virtual entity, and on the fields I have added this new air date, and if you simply mark this as optional, that means the related mapping or configuration is disturbed, then also we will see what kind of issues that you will face. So now after saving it, I have published it. Only change that I have made this time is I have made this air date field as non-mandatory, but in our external data source it is still non-nullable type. So now I'll refresh the screen. So notice that here some error has been occurred. Entity could not be retrieved from data source. Please try again or contact your system administrator. Which proves that just by changing the requirement level of the field, which is not matching in the external data source, you are getting some sort of error. So now I will revert back the changes and we will see that whether this error gets resolved or not. So now again I'm modifying the requirement level of this field. From optional I'm again making it to business required. I'm publishing this entity. I'm refreshing it now. So now you can see that it has retrieved the record successfully, which proves that the only issue was with the requirement level. And one more thing, it is not mandatory to map all the fields that are present in external data source. You can also map only the required fields that you want to capture in Dynamics 365 instance. So having said that, this is how you can create a virtual entity in your Dynamics 365 instance and map any external data source in your Dynamics 365 instance without writing a single piece of code. At the same time, let us now also see the things that you need to keep in mind while working with virtual entities in Dynamics 365. Once you have defined an entity, you cannot convert any existing entity into virtual entities, or after creating a virtual entity, you will not be able to convert it to regular entities. By default, virtual entities contains only name and ID field. No other system managed fields such as status, created on, modified on are supported for virtual entities that we have already seen in our practical demo. Virtual entities do not support custom fields with currency, image or customer data types. You cannot create any field of type currency, image or customer type into virtual entities. Virtual entities are organization owned and do not support row level common data service for app security concepts. So we have already seen that virtual entities are always organization owned and you do not have row level or record level control over the virtual entity data records. Either they are available to all or none. So Microsoft recommends that you implement your own custom security model for external data source. And at the same time, Microsoft recommends that you target a single data source when you use these virtual entities in advanced find. For example, creating an advanced find that ultimately creates a join between common data service, native data, and the virtual entity external data is not supported. So if you are retrieving certain records using advanced find query, and in that query, if you are performing some sort of external joins between your virtual entity and the out of the box entities or the regular entities, then those kind of joins or those kind of complex queries are not supported when you are working with virtual entities in Dynamics 365. Field metadata properties that validate on update don't apply to the virtual entities. For example, whole number field on virtual entity may be said to have a minimum value of 0, but however, since the value is coming from an external data source, a query will return values less than 0 when retrieved from a virtual entity. The minimum value property is not implied in the query. You would still need to filter the values to be greater than 0 if that is what is desired. So this means that even though the minimum value for a whole number in Dynamics 365 instance is starting from 0, but still, since the data is coming from an external data source, so there may be certain situation that in external data source the value is stored as negative or less than 0, then the minimum value restriction on the whole number field is not implied. So this kind of things you need to keep in mind. So you need to be very cautious while retrieving those record in your SDK or advanced find. If you want to retrieve values greater than 0, then you need to specify in your filter criteria. And also virtual entity do not support the change tracking and cannot be synchronized by using a customer engagement feature such as data export service. So these were the few things that you need to keep in mind while working with virtual entities. So I thank you for watching this video till the end, and I hope that you have learned something new in this video. And if you like this video, so please do not forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe and share the Dynamix Academy videos to all your friends and colleagues, those who are working in Dynamics 365 or those who want to start their career in Microsoft Dynamics 365, which is one of the hottest and trending technology in the market today. So on that note, I take your leave and I hope to see you all in the next video. Till then, bye bye and take care.